Okay, maybe we can begin. One of our panelists just informed me that she has to leave at 6:30 sharp to catch a flight back to London. So it's part of my job to make sure that we stick to schedule. My name is Sanjay Ruprelia. I teach in the politics department here at the New School. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this final session of our conference today. The title of the session is Sovereignty, Law, and Justice, a very evocative title. And as a way of introducing the papers, three very rich papers in this issue, which I admit I read very quickly, but on reading them quickly realized I have to go back and reread them more carefully to really extract everything they have to say. I was thinking about how to think about the relationship between these three words, concepts, norms, and aspirations. And in a sense, India's constitutional democracy, its constitution itself, the longest in the world, is a very useful prism in which to think about, I think, these three concepts, and both the promises that they raise, but also the tensions between them. Granville Austin, a historian and scholar of the Constitution, once proclaimed that the Indian Constitution was united by a seamless web. And that web had three elements: national unity, democracy and rights, and social revolution. Now, needless to say, it's a web that many people would say is not seamless and has had multiple frays and challenges. And I think when you think about India's constitutional democracy in the long run, over 6 decades, like with most things in India, you can see sort of polar or opposite perspectives at once when you're trying to understand what is the condition of India's constitutional democracy. On the one hand, is still a phenomenal achievement of a modern representative democracy based on universal suffrage against great historical odds in 1947. The first time that universal suffrage was introduced in a society which was predominantly agrarian, with a vast majority of the population living in great poverty, with immense social difference and great social inequalities. And so its consolidation and persistence over 6 decades itself is quite a remarkable fact. India had a 2-year period of authoritarian rule, but like in good Indian traditions, or one tradition we're going to hear about, it ended with an election. It's not often that constitutional dictatorships end with an election. And in recent decades, the last 2 or 3, we've witnessed a remarkable expansion and deepening of democracy in India, as historically subordinate groups increasingly participate in elections, often in greater numbers than more privileged sections, in which parties which seek to represent these groups, a proliferation of lower caste parties, regional parties, have come to power in many states. And also, since the 1980s, a remarkable upswing in the proliferation of NGOs, popular social movements, the rise of judicial activism in the case of public interest litigation, which have really energized a very contentious democratic experiment. So these are all signs of the vitality of India's constitutional democracy as a way of trying to understand and mediate sovereignty, law, and justice. And yet, of course, on the other hand, we can see a different perspective as well, which is, despite this gradual progress, there's still a persistence of a very high level of human deprivation. In the last 20 years, mounting evidence, although contested by some quarters, of increasing social inequalities, rising urban-rural disparities, increasing gap between different states of the country. And not least, of course, as one of the papers today will speak about, that on the one hand, while India's federal system has been, in some cases, quite remarkable in being able to accommodate different aspirations for cultural recognition and political power, in the most critical contested regions, it has not. In the Northeast, in Jammu, Kashmir, where the writ of the Union is fiercely contested for good reason. And it's in these areas that the balance of coercion and consent, which has held together the Indian Union, has been unfortunately balanced often towards the former. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our three speakers. I'll introduce them in order. The first is Mukulika Banerjee. She's a reader in social anthropology at the London School of Economics. She has a very wide range of interests, and amongst her major publications, I'll just name a few: The Pathan Unarmed, Opposition and Memory in the Northwest Frontier Province, Muslim Portraits, Everyday Lives in India, a book, which is the last time I met Mukulika in New York, called The Sari, which is co-written. I can't remember the other author's name at the moment. And an edited book called Effervescent Democracy, which is also the subject of her talk tonight. The second speaker is Gopal, who's professor of social and political theory at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Amongst his many publications, books and essays are Dalit and Cultural Politics in Maharashtra, Atrophy of Dalit Politics, and recently an edited collection which has received a lot of critical attention titled Humiliation, Claims and Contexts. And our third speaker is Suvir Kaul, who's an A.M. Rosenthal Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, and again, a very widely written author of many books and articles. I'll mention just three: 18th Century English Literature and Postcolonial Studies, Poems of Nation, Anthems of Empire, English Verse in the Long 18th Century, and finally, The Partitions of Memory, the Afterlife of the Division of India. And I think also, I'll just end on this note of introduction, I also think what's very stimulating about these three essays, both independently but read in conjunction, is the very different disciplinary backgrounds that they come from. Anthropology, political and social theory, and comparative literature, in terms of formal disciplinary backgrounds. But what's common amongst the essays also is a very critical ethnographic sensibility, a very fine sort of focused observation of the realities and textures of everyday life in India. And so would you please welcome our first speaker, Mukulika Banerjee.
Thank you to Arjun and Erin for this invitation. Thank you also to Sanjay for saving me time for my 20 minutes. The provisos of celebrating India's elections, which I'm about to do, hold. He said what is wrong with Indian democracy and our political record in India. So please keep that at the back of your minds while we hear about elections as Communitas. I will argue on the basis of about 13 years of immersed fieldwork in a couple of adjacent villages in West Bengal, some observations that I make about Indian democracy in general. And about today, what I'll be talking about is a part of that broader argument about Indian elections. And I make the argument that Indian elections are probably India's most sacred modern ritual. The basis of all my work so far has been a very simple research question. Why on earth do people in India bother to vote? Right? And not only do they vote with enthusiasm, they vote in very large numbers. As we speak, in less than 36 hours, we're going to have the results of 5 states who've gone to the polls. And we're going to hear about some major upheavals in some of these places. And already we know the voter turnout figures for Puducherry, for West Bengal, they're well above 85% in most places. And this is by no means unusual. West Bengal's election this time is a watershed election, but it is not unusual to have such large voter turnout figures. As Sanjay has already said, not only do people vote in large numbers, but also that people at the bottom of the social hierarchy vote more. Rural people and small town people tend to vote more. And the more local the election, the greater the participation. So panchayat elections, it's practically 100%. In the state level elections, which we are seeing at the moment, they are very high and they fall with national elections. All of these are counterintuitive. They go against the histories of older democracies in the world. So why do people vote is what I'm interested in. Now, one the question is deliberately provocative to my colleagues in political science, with whom I've had a long and engaged dialogue, I have to say. The question in political science is usually who's going to win, who will win, right? That's the drama that you get on election night, who's going to win the election. But I would argue that, in fact, even before you can pose the question of who's going to win, you need people to vote, and people need to have to feel bothered enough to vote. Now, a lot of the political science kind of discussions, when they do turn their attention to why do people vote, is couched in rationality arguments. And part of one strand that I pick up of this argument in the longer piece that's published in Social Research is the issue of free riding. Why don't people just free ride? In a large collective activity like voting, you can easily hide and not bother to vote, because that kind of large-scale cooperative activity, it is easier to free ride than, say, voting in a committee room. It is easier to not vote in a large constituency. And of course, we just had the referendum in Britain about the change in the electoral system. And columnists wrote very funny, sarcastic, thoughtful, cynical articles about how they had managed to pull it off by not voting, and then they were consumed by guilt and so on about whether they should. Now, all this just doesn't work in India, and you'll see why. Why do voters simply not cheat in elections and simply pretend to vote? Now, the anti-free riding arguments that Richard Tuck, for instance, who recently wrote a book about this, says that in an activity like voting, it is actually more rational not to free ride, because these are what he calls threshold activities, where your one vote can actually tip the balance to beyond 50%, and your vote might actually be the winning vote, so to speak. So in fact, it would be irrational not to vote. And that's the tenor of. But at the end of the day, the discussions about whether the theater of politics, of actually turning up to vote, is something that is dismissed as a sort of expressive aspect of democracy, which is not really the really important thing, because surely democracy and electoral politics, at least, is a numbers game. And who wins is the ultimate question, not the expressive. And I argue exactly the opposite, entirely on the basis of my data. Now, in India, when you ask people why they vote, I have heard a story recounted, which I recount in the piece, which I'll do briefly, is that people say, well, look, when I say, why do you vote, and why don't you hide, and you can pretend not to. I didn't say why you can't hide, but why do you vote? They tell me the story of this king who had a feast in his village and decided that he would provide everybody the meal, but the pudding would be made up with cups of milk brought from each household. So everybody would contribute a cup of milk and bring it to the center of the village in the vat and pour it in. A miser, there's always a miser in these stories, a miser thought, why am I going to part with my cup of milk for which everybody is going to consume? I'll just take a cup of water. So he took a cup of water and opened the lid and quickly sneaked it in, and then sat back, enjoyed the feast, waiting for pudding. Lo and behold, at the end of the meal, when the cover was lifted, there was a vat of boiling water. Everybody had the same idea. Now, what people said to me was, this is why you cannot cheat. If we all start to cheat, it doesn't work. And this is not the kind of rationality, it is not about threshold activities. It's coming from a completely different cultural imaginary that is at work. The second thing, which institutionalization of certain practices by the Election Commission, which are innumerable practices which have made elections have the kind of credibility in modern India, is this business, the image you see of this man with a black mark on his, I've got to find a better term, if somebody can give me an alternative to the black mark. It's a coveted stigmata, it's what people want, is the mark that you have on your finger when you voted. So you cannot hide, you cannot pretend to have voted if you don't have the black line. It's pretty. And instead of, you could say that, people will say, okay, if the free rider might think, well, look, 60% of the village has voted. If I don't vote, it doesn't matter. That's not actually what happens. What happens is, because you get a black mark, everybody wants the black mark. And if you don't have a black mark, people absolutely, there's a deluge of questions all day saying, when are you going to vote, when are you going to vote, when are you going to vote? And then you think, oh, forget it, I'll just go and vote. It's much easier to go and vote. So this peer pressure that is created, which, by the way, in Switzerland too, they found that when they switched to postal ballots, thinking it's more convenient for people, let's make it easy for them, voter turnout rates actually dropped, because in small cantons you wanted to be seen to be doing this. So it is not merely an Indian phenomenon, but certainly one that is at work. So peer pressure is actually a very important reason. And again, an anti-rational one, but not of the kind of threshold activity kind of argument. Is there cynicism? When people are voting, are they gullible? I cannot now, I've lost count of the numbers of conversations I've had with people of my class and education, who, of course, when you talk about high rates of voter turnouts in India amongst the rural poor, they say, oh yes, they do it because they're told to do it, or they don't know any better, and they think they're going to get something. And of course, all those reasons work. There are instrumental reasons. The DMK might, in fact, not be toppled in Tamil Nadu because they had 2 rupee kilos of rice, and so on. But whether this affects people actually getting to the polling station is something that is completely unsubstantiated, and one that we tested through a national study in the 2009 elections in 12 different sites in India to test why people were doing this. So we have pretty good data now, ethnographic data across India. Now, there is cynicism. There is a huge amount of cynicism, and the quickest way to encapsulate this cynicism is to identify these two realms of politics that seem to be at work. One is the realm of what I call Rajniti, not least because there's been a recent, last year, a very, very popular film that did very well at the box office, which was ostensibly about democratic politics. It was everything but it was certainly about electoral politics, but about the elite. And Rajniti is demonic, and as the film actually was very good at capturing, it spirals out of control and into violence. And that is the idea that most ordinary voters have about politicians, that they're venal, they're corrupt, they do nothing for the people, they are rascals, and in fact, it is a corrupting domain. So if you ask somebody, the people I know in the village very well and aspiring, I say, you can talk, you have people who like you, why don't you stand for panchayat elections? They'll say, oh, no, if I stand for, I'll become a leader and then I'll become like them, I'll become demonic. So it is seen to be a very corrupting influence. But which is not to say that encapsulates all understandings of politics. Outside that demonic Rajniti is a popular politics, which is about them. And on election day, I would argue that politics comes to the fore. And that is when, as people say, on that one day, we are Ek Din Ka Sultan. Today, I am king. So it doesn't matter who the politicians are, they have to come begging for votes, and if I don't vote, the system collapses. So I have to be, I need to experience this. Now, this contradiction between demonic politics and popular politics, and really the popular politics, often in large parts of India, the word for it is politics, rather than any Sanskritized word like Rajniti, which is really, it is about elite politics, what powerful people do. Now, so just to shift that a little bit, what I would like to therefore suggest is that if we can see elections, I'm doing this in a rush, if we see elections as ritual, I would argue, let me first, the proviso is that please eliminate any whiff of incense from my use of ritual here. Right? This has nothing to do with religion. It is a very anthropological sense of ritual. And some of the features I thought I would identify here, which are central to the argument, which is that rituals, all rituals, whether they're the initiation rituals, weddings, funerals, whatever ritual that you can think of, they contain what Victor Turner calls liminal moments, using Van Gennep's work. Now, liminality is the state where you are neither in one state nor the other. So somebody, say a young boy being initiated, bar mitzvah, anything. One day you're a young boy, then you have a bar mitzvah, next day you're a man, notionally, socially, that's what you are. But on the day of bar mitzvah, on the day of liminality, you're nothing. You're neither here nor you're there. But these stages are also inherently unstable, and they are by definition transitional, so they cannot endure for long periods of time. They are momentary. And it therefore, because they mark what is called anti-structure, it's not social structure, it's not everyday, it is extraordinary. They lie on the outside, on the peripheries of everyday life. And because of their instability, because of the quality of life on that one day, they are considered sacred by all ritual systems. Now, an election, I would argue, is democracy's liminal moment, and it is marked by the quality of what Turner calls communitas. Now, communitas is this mode of social relatedness, and these are quotes from Turner, where there is this community of feeling, where you're not tied by blood or locality. And this is exactly what, if you look at the culture of a polling station anywhere in India at any election, that is what people are saying. They dress up, they have a bath, everybody has a bath before they go to vote. They wear fresh clothes and they wear their best saris. Women do. I mean, even poor women who have one best sari wear it on Eid, they'll wear it at a wedding, they'll wear it on polling day. That's what the best sari is for. And they go there because when you ask people what is so special about the voting process itself, they say, look, the rest of the time, I am Dalit, I might be disabled, I am illiterate, I am a farmer, I'm identified by all of these markers. On that one day, I'm nothing but a voter. That's my only marker of identity. So these bonds that are created, and we in our national project, we tried to provide some fine-grained data on what people were saying, and the camaraderie of people waiting in line at a polling station is very strong. So this glimpse of political equality in the face of deep, deep social inequality is therefore very valuable. And its aspiration towards egalitarianism, of universalism, of openness, is threatening. It's a carnival. There's always armed guards outside a polling station in India, always. And the Election Commission has a huge job controlling what this exercise of affect can actually create. Now, just to take a brief visual interlude, having just come back from West Bengal last week, I thought I'd give you a sense of what liminality actually does to the landscape of a state when elections are on. How long do I have, Sanjay? 5 minutes. Okay, that's good. So just quickly to run you through some pictures. In the past, these are images from the 2006 elections when Mamata Banerjee, I'm sure some of you will know Indian electoral politics, yes? When Mamata Banerjee was considered to be a serious contender to the Left Front, and the Left Front has been ruling in West Bengal since '77, it's been in power. And Mamata Banerjee, who heads a party called Trinamool Congress, was seen to be the serious contender, a challenger to them. And so she was seriously lampooned by the Left Front through a number of different walling, as it's called, pictures on walls. His master's voice, because she had an alliance with the BJP. And then this time, suddenly the slogans, the world's a different place, no peace, no discipline, no democracy. There is nothing more left in West Bengal, one of the posters said. And throughout the state, these are just images that you collect as you travel through the state. The three colors of Trinamool, the tricolor that they use in their thing, is everywhere. It's on saris, it's on umbrellas, it's on flags, it's on bunting. And the same familiar spaces are taken over by processions of people getting together, having street corner meetings, setting up impromptu stages, loudspeakers. So the visual oral landscape of an Indian election is a very intense moment, just as any liminal moment, that betwixt and between moment in a ritual. Tractors are used to bring people in to meetings, and they're festooned with flags and colors. In the village, you don't ever, this is in a household I know very well, these are people who don't belong to this household. They just came in because the guy who works there works for a political party, and they knew he'd have a copy of the voters list, and they came busily to check whether their name was definitely there. Men and women sitting like this together looking at pieces of paper doesn't happen at any other context of village social life. And on the landscape, next to hoardings of TV programs and advertisements, you see this in the streets of Kolkata, for instance, follow your heart, don't waste your vote. And this is an advertisement by a newspaper. Next to television serials, you get this. You get popular personalities endorsing, asking people to vote, to go out and vote. And Mamata, in her series of different slogans, has captured every aspect of that landscape. And so that visual deluge that every voter is hit by. And then, of course, the CPM is not to be left behind. You have loud-hailers sort of jostling for space next to each other. And the slogans were fantastic for anyone who understands Bengali. Banglar Rai Bamfront Biday. So there are little couplets like this, little rhyming couplets, which basically says Bengal's verdict is it's goodbye to the left front. And this one, very telling, Bodla Noy, Bodol Chai. We don't want revenge, we want a change, right? But a play on the word of Badla and Badal. So Trinamool's flying high, and in 36 hours we are going to see this. I wanted to show you this as well, because this is by the Election Commission, a poster that was put up in several places. Again, telling people to go out and vote without any fear, right? Eta apnar odhikar, it's your right. Apnar shokti, it's your strength. So go and vote because it's your right and it's your strength. And the Election Commission, I argue in this piece and elsewhere in my work, is really very understudied. It comes out in all the national election surveys as the most respected public institution in India. It's the one institution that works in India. And Indian elections happen at a scale which is unmatched by any other man-made event, right? 1 million electronic voting machines, 8 million polling stations, 2 million polling officials. I mean, the scale is absolutely enormous, and it happens pretty much error-free at the moment. So, if you had to conclude, why do people vote? I would say that elections provide in Indian public life these moments of communitas, which have that quality of affect, of carnival, of anti-structure that are valued simply because in those moments, participants are able to glimpse something that is coveted and yet is missing from everyday life. And you are able to participate it only on certain days, on polling days. It's a proof of citizenship, and here I'd just like to mention again that when talking to completely people who cannot write their names, adult illiteracy is very high in a number of places, certainly where I work. People very routinely will use words for duty, rights, citizenship, and say that this is a proof of that I belong, that I exist, and it is, if I don't even vote, people are going to forget the poor exist in India. So this idea of odhikar and daitto that you get of udimai and kadamai in Tamil, they're used together always as interchangeably, and allows a model of cooperation, which again, in my wider argument about democracy, I'd say, is actually rooted in other social imaginaries which come out of other work groups, kinship, religious meetings, etc., where people know how to come together, know how to create something that is larger than themselves, and understand that every individual contribution is a very important element of that final product. And election campaigns, this should have come earlier. One of the things about the election campaigns, to go back to that distinction between Rajniti and everyday politics and popular politics, is that campaigns are a very good mode. People love election campaigns, mainly because the rich and the powerful in their crisp white clothes are humbled. Their clothes get filthy and crumpled, and they're sweaty, and Rahul Gandhi is unshaved constantly through a campaign. They're humbled, and people say, look, on this one day in a Bombay slum in Bandra, people were saying, look at the height of this doorway. And through this politician has to bend low with folded hands and come and ask for my vote. I know it doesn't mean he's going to forget about us, but at least he has to do this. And that is a very powerful emotion. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Gopal Guru.
Dear friends, both female and male, it's fair on my part to thank Arjun for inviting me to contribute to this wonderful volume of papers. I also take this opportunity to thank Arjun and Aaron for helping me to stay focused in the essay I have written. I was unruly in the first version, but they really disciplined me actually very seriously. I thank them for that. I also thank my colleague Gurpreet Mahajan for helping me to really orient myself. I'm going to make my own assessment of India's democracy. And I want to start my presentation with two provocative comments. One is that in India, a circle of scholars have really concluded, now they have written the last word on democracy, and they have exhausted all the reference points, and the description of democracy is not just possible. That's the Brahma Vakya they have written on democracy. I would like to differ. If that is the case, why should I write a paper on the title Liberal Democracy in India and its Dalit critic? I'm already suggesting that there's more to the critique of democracy than what has been done so far by the scholars who claim that the discussion on democracy is already over. The status of debate on democracy is already very, very rich. But I think I have a different point. I would like to read, and then Sanjay, just please stop me if I'm really crossing the limit. Generally speaking, liberal democracy in India, which has emerged in the context of the anti-colonial nationalism, has remained differently attractive to social groups. For example, the modernizing elite, and I would add social elite actually, who are from different upper caste backgrounds from Maharashtra and West Bengal, particularly Bhadralok in West Bengal and the Chitwan Brahmins in Maharashtra. For example, the modernizing elite in India was drawn towards in liberal democracy primarily because it promised them an opportunity to recover and expand the power and influence that was constricted during the colonial rule. However, they did not seem to be in favor of extending the benefits of liberal democracy beyond their own interest. On the other side of continuum, I would have said spectrum, but spectrum I don't want to use now. It's a bad word in India. On the other side of this continuum, Dalits led by Dr. Ambedkar feared that this modernizing elite would use liberal democracy less for decentralizing political power, more for expanding and consolidating the social power, which is embedded in caste and gender as well. Even after independence, Dalit response to liberal democracy continues to be skeptical. They at one level relate themselves to liberal democracy because it offered them an opportunity to acquire and hold on to the normative spaces, entailing the promise of not just equality, liberty, and rights, but more importantly, self-respect and dignity. And this is the point of departure from the earlier critique of democracy. They are prepared to invest in democracy as a joint project in designing the normative framework within which they, along with others, would feel equally counted, not just in terms of democracy and citizenship, but also in terms of leading a very decent human life. So the question is not getting equality before law, but also getting equality before moral law. So I'm pushing the question of democracy in the realm of civil society, not simply in the realm of legality and state. That is the point of departure from the mainstream critique of democracy. The Dalit they also feel related to democracy for getting the normative rights, but at the same time they also feel frustrated with the democratic practices and experiment in India. Majority of them continue to feel frustrated about the democratic state, which has failed to give concrete expression to their collective aspirations. In the published essay, I argue that the failure of democracy has to be understood in terms of the mutual inability of civil society and democracy to absorb within each other normative concepts like recognition and dignity. I further argue that over-determining influence of social configuration of power In social configuration of power, I include Brahmanism and capitalism together. I further argue that over-determining influence of social configuration of power, Brahmanism and capitalism, has bearing on this mutual inability of state and civil society to give frustrating experience to Dalit in terms of democratic aspiration. This configuration has a limiting impact on the capacity of liberal democracy to reduce the concentration of political power. Dalits find themselves on the margin of the hegemonic terrain of political and social power. I see it's a hegemonic word. We can discuss this if in the question answer session. Dalit critique of liberal democracy looks valid in as much as it does not, it goes beyond the mainstream assessment of democracy in India. It seeks to critique this mainstream understanding on the ground that the latter is not sufficiently sensitive to the fact that Indian democracy is deficient on normative grounds. The mainstream critique of democracy focuses its attention on the question of mal-distribution of resources, therefore implicating the concept of inequality and injustice. That's to say, the mainstream critique of democracy is focusing only on the questions of inequality and injustice. It does not question liberal democracy, even if the latter produces maltreatment and maladjustment of a vast number of people who have almost disappeared from the collective concerns of both the state and civil society. In India, you have increasing process of invisibilizing people, and they are more in Delhi and Mumbai now. And they don't figure in the democratic imagination of the civil society and the state. I don't know whether they are really holding any card, whether they vote, I just don't know. Secondly, Dalit critique looks valid in as much as it interrogates what could be termed as the subsidized notion of liberal democracy. What do I mean by subsidized notion? Subsidized notion is that, despite the fact that we have several problems about democracy in India, still democracy is surviving. That is the subsidized notion of democracy. So we should celebrate democracy, though it is suffering from several infirmities. Secondly, Dalit critique looks valid in as much as it interrogates what could be termed as subsidized notion of democracy, which ensures just rhetorical accommodation into ever-shrinking opportunity structures and spaces. On a positive note, however, Dalit critique underscores the need for an alternative conception of democracy based on progressive realization of self-esteem and self-respect. I don't have time to really differentiate between the two terms, but they are different. Now, Dalit critique thus asks this question: to what extent the democratic institutions in India have provided space for the realization of these primary goods, self-respect and dignity? This question acquires similar importance in the context of the assumption that modern institutions, by their very nature, do not humiliate people. This is the dominant understanding. Dalit critique is not completely dismissive of the gains of democratic practices. It acknowledges that Dalits in post-colonial India have made some tangible achievements. It is also true that these achievements have helped Dalits to gain some self-esteem and also gain some meaning to their life. They feel more positive about themselves than ever before. And I have mentioned some new terminology that has come in. Dalit have moved from their traditionally inferior description of dhed. Now, this dhed word is used for untouchables in Gujarat. All the untouchables called dhed. So they have moved from dhed to becoming the head of the institution, dhed and head. So that is the transition that has taken place, and therefore they should thank the democratic experience in India. It could be argued that liberal democracy in India has helped them to develop self-esteem either through actual occupation of public office or through designated empowerment. And this designated empowerment is an interesting word, and I would request you to focus on this particular word. The Dalit develop their self-esteem through designated empowerment because those particularly common Dalits who are not themselves in the position of power, but succeed in deterring an upper caste local adversary by making a reference to a Dalit who is in fact in power. And this has reference to UP Chief Minister. Don't touch me, my Chief Minister is sitting in Lucknow. So that is the designated empowerment. On a different reading, Dalit have been considered as the most important source of sustaining liberal democracy. That's the point, there are studies now that who makes democracy survive and meaningful is only Dalit, who have been already voting in large numbers. So the main backbone of Indian democracy, electoral democracy, is Dalit. That is the conclusion that people, and for right reasons, are drawn. So one could therefore argue that there is a symbiotic relationship between liberal democracy and Dalit political aspirations to achieve self-esteem through status enhancement and develop a positive sense of self through cultivating normative aspirations for the self-respect. Both political and normative aspirations are externally induced. Both political and normative aspirations are externally induced by the very logic of liberal democracy and internally driven by the moral need to count equally with others in the moral order of the nation. I have no time to define what is moral order of the nation. There is a long history to this word, starting going back to 19th century, involving leading political thinkers in India. So they define what is moral order of the nation. In the present context, moral order of a nation is defined as the static expression of ethical relations that generate morally minimum decent human being. What is moral minimum is the baseline or lifeline of the moral order of the nation. The political order in liberal democracy, on the other hand, is based on dynamic relationship, which in terms is based on the principle of rotation of position. Rotation principle as a distributive principle of justice ultimately creates a space for self-esteem, but it does not automatically generate the benefits of self-respect. So self-respect and self-esteem, maybe I'll take half a minute to explain this. Self-esteem is that you can achieve your positional status, you can go up, you can really have chauffeur-driven car, you can have big bungalow, and there are some darbans who can salute you when you enter the parliament. That is the you feel, self-esteem. But do you get self-respect? But self-respect, you may not get self-respect, but you have to bow down before somebody who is your patronage, your patron. So self-respect is in conflict with self-esteem. So that's the point I'm raising. And therefore I'm raising this point, to what extent Indian democracy has really empowered Dalit to gain self-respect and not just self-esteem. That is the crucial question. A Dalit audit of liberal democracy over the last 60 years suggests that liberal democracy has proffered a skewed response to the Dalit question. One hinging on everyday forms of humiliation, degradation, repulsion, exclusion, rejection, and reduction. Rejection and reduction, these are very important words. And I use them in my work on humiliation. I'm just inviting you to not only just read my paper in this published volume, but also humiliation. In fact, the Dalit adversaries use the very democratic institutions as the site for inflicting maltreatment on Dalits and maladjusting the latter to these institutions. Maltreatment and maladjustments are deeply humiliating practices which generate a sense of wretchedness among the Dalits in India. These practices, which are rampant among the upper echelons of the society, regressively convert politics of presence. I think this is a very important line. The practices which are rampant among the upper caste regressively convert politics of presence, as articulated by Dalits in Indian context, into the politics of xenophobia. Xenophobic politics, I'm using a very strong word, I'm aware about it, but we can discuss it. I don't think I can complete, but anyway, I'll just try. Xenophobic politics deployed by the upper caste finds their expression in the constant efforts made by the latter, who seeks to create Dalit arrival at different participatory processes of the menace to democracy. Hence, the need for isolating and insulating oneself from institutions. Now, I have no time to really. I'll just make 2 points. One is that in India, you have institutions exclusively meant for the Dalits. And why they are meant for the Dalits? Not for the benefits of the Dalits, but to really seek insulation and isolation so that you stay pure. So you find that the old social relationship of Agrahara and Cherry are reproduced in the democratic institution. That's the punchline. Okay? For example, you just find out a upper caste secretary doesn't want to be transferred to social justice department. He or she considers it to be a punishment to Kalapani. So you are being sent to a cellular jail. That is the xenophobic understanding. And so that is one. The other one is the Dalit themselves have internalized this logic of this dharma, Manu dharma, that I have to really, I just can't transgress the social boundaries. I have to stay within the boundaries. And this is a very, very tragic case, I would say outstanding case of this dharma being followed by the Dalit legislator. In Karnataka, and I'm just using Karnataka, there was reference to Karnataka, the fellow who is elected democratically by people, not only just Dalit but everybody, is refusing to sit in the chair. He's sitting on the floor. And when people ask him, why don't you, it's your right to sit in the chair, you occupy the chair along with others. He says, sir, how can I occupy the chair when you are sitting in the chair? Now, how do you understand this? Can you just therefore condemn this person as being completely, deeply servile? Or he is also making a larger statement on the social reality of untouchability, which is very, very rampant. Is that the representation he is making on a very, very sympathetic reading? And I think that is the question that one has to ask while one is really assessing the question of democracy. The last point is this. The paradox of Indian democracy is this. While it creates creamy layers through the state intervention of quota and reservation, you have creamy layer now. At the same time, it also corrupts the motivating cream from within the Dalit community. And that is the tragedy of democracy. So you need to have critical imagination expanding in the oppositional sphere, but the oppositional sphere is shrinking because of the very impact of democracy. So this is the paradox. And I think this paradox is endemic to liberal democracy. Because liberal and democracy, these are two mutually conflicting terms, and we have no time to really explain them. We'll get back to it. Thank you very much. Okay.
And our, our final speaker is Suvir Kaul.
I want to thank Arjun and Aryan, not simply for the conference, but also for allowing me not to summarize the essay that they have published in this volume. I'm going to summarize an essay that was published in Economic and Political Weekly not 3 weeks ago. These are companion pieces for me, my attempts to try and explain to myself as well as to others how to understand the challenge of Kashmir for post-colonial India. And I was particularly interested in offering this summary of an earlier paper, because this is very much about the challenge of Kashmir to India in the world, to India's world. The other paper, which has been published in this volume of social research, which for those of you who decide to spend your $15, is much more about Kashmir's history or Kashmir's modern history and my attempts to explain that. This essay has a byline, which I'm retaining. Srinagar, Jammu and Kashmir, August 15, 2010. Writing an essay on the persistence of colonial modes of thought and forms of governance in post-colonial India while living in a city under constant curfew, where 57 demonstrators have been killed. This is what happened the 15th of August last year. After that, the numbers rose to anywhere between 112 and to 116 people killed. And many more injured. No policemen and army men were killed in the same street protests. And many more injured in police firing in the last 2 months brings to a crisis many of the certainties that usually inform post-colonial analyses of an independent nation like India. There is first the startling realization that the key terms of anti-colonialism articulated by Indian nationalists provide the intellectual and political framework of Kashmiri activists. India is the colonial power, Indian armed forces and occupation force, members of the elected state government are collaborators and stooges of the central government, and the job of senior bureaucrats is to deny avenues for Kashmiri self-determination. Further, Kashmiri nationalists make clear that their movement is not simply concerned with economic betterment. In response to the Prime Minister's promises of more jobs, they argue that their goal is political self-determination and that they do not sacrifice lives for bread alone. Their movement is for Azadi, a word once so dear to Indian anti-colonialism, except that it is now the Indian state that thwarts freedom. Kashmiri newspapers sympathetic to the desire of Azadi reprint the work of Indian and indeed Pakistani revolutionary poets, where once Sahir Ludhianvi or Faiz Ahmad Faiz spoke out against imperialists. Their poems now provide sustenance for the Kashmiri movement as it struggles against Indian domination. Conversely, the response of the Indian state, the central and state governments and the armed forces whose highly intrusive presence warps civilian life, has been to treat the sustained protests as a law and order problem and to crack down militarily. Even when the Prime Minister and the Home Minister have spoken of Kashmir's unique, this is their word, unique status within the Indian Union and of the need for an equally unique resolution, their promises lack conviction and in any case are treated by Kashmiris as only the latest attempts to mollify political protests and perpetuate a fraudulent, uneasy peace. Further, ideologues of Kashmiri independence, or even those Kashmiris who favor achieving the autonomy guaranteed by Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, have developed dense historical accounts of the long Kashmiri struggle against their colonizers that goes back to the 16th century. First the Mughal conquest, then Afghan rule, then Sikh, then Dogra, and now Indian. In sum, many of the political and ideological features of classic 20th century anti-colonial movements are in place in the Kashmiri struggle for self-determination. This reversal of India's post-colonial credentials is one reason why otherwise progressive Indian intellectuals have found it difficult to respond to the challenge posed by Kashmir. We have long assumed the ethical gravitas of being inheritors of a proud anti-colonial nationalism, and even though we have developed critiques of the practices of democracy in India, we assume that the state, warts and all, is fundamentally post-colonial in its self-conception and functioning. That is, we are convinced that the actions of politicians, bureaucrats, and the police and military officials vis-à-vis particular communities, no matter how polarized, are comprehensible within an analytics of fledgling democracy. However, in other areas of governance, the self-righteous and aggressive nationalism that our anti-colonial history has bred has caused us to blunt our critiques of state functioning. Precisely because we dethroned an empire, we believe that independence inaugurated a fundamentally different form of sovereign constitutional rule that safeguards the state from assuming any of the attributes of the colonial state. No longer do viceroys rule subjects. Now, elected officials rule in the name and with the electoral consent of citizens. There is, of course, another massive reason why Indians have turned away from examining the history of Kashmir that has fed the violent and non-violent forms of protest in the last 2 decades in particular. As we know, in winter 1989, a full-blown insurrection led by heavily armed militants broke out against the Indian government. The militants styled themselves the new cutting edge of a decades-long drive for Kashmiri independence. Within a year or two of the conflict breaking out, the majority of the Kashmiri Hindu population fled the valley, and very few of them have returned permanently since. It is safe to say that no one in this small minority, less than 5% of the population, sympathized with the desire for independence. Some of them were targeted by the militants and their civilian sympathizers, and the resultant fear caused the large mass of them to leave. Their flight encouraged Indians to believe that they were dealing not with a political movement for independence, but with a virulently sectarian form of Islamic secessionism. Further, state administrators insisted that the militants were fighting a proxy war for Pakistan and refused to acknowledge any indigenous roots for this uprising. Many militants were in fact Pakistani and Afghan veterans of battles against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and militant groups were in fact funded and trained in Pakistan. There's lots of evidence for this. But most, in fact, were young Kashmiri men who joined one of the many groups that formed splintered, and reformed in the 1990s. They, as well as civilians caught in the crossfire, bore the brunt of the casualties in their battle against Indian forces. This is a different section. One of the powerful and unfortunate legacies of the partition process, the violence, the bewildering dislocation of populations, and the 15 months of battle, this is often forgotten, the 15 months of battles between India and Pakistan at the margins of Jammu and Kashmir in 1947 and 1948, was the enduring sense that each state needed to develop a massive military machinery to safeguard its borders. These boundaries were to be defended at all costs, not only against external enemies, but also against secessionist movements or movements seeking different forms of autonomy. That is, rather than the state functioning as the prime agency that would encourage citizens to evolve more progressive and equitable power-sharing arrangements across the nation, the state acted primarily to preserve the boundaries of the Union inherited from the British Empire. This was true even when this cartographic inheritance had been crafted without considering the particular histories of local populations, and even if the policing required for the maintenance of borders involved the suspension of democratic principles. Thus, one of the cardinal features of state formation in the independent nation has become the development of an elaborate security apparatus, ostensibly designed to guard international borders, but in effect to act internally against restive populations contained by the force of historical circumstance within those borders. Indeed, one might argue that this security apparatus, developed under the cover of an aggressive celebratory nationalism, is an important element of the post-colonial state's claim to legitimacy. I'm arguing here that attention to the particular form of state formation that we inherited from modern empire, the British Empire, helps us understand some of the deeply undemocratic imperatives and neo-colonial ambitions of the post-colonial nation-state today. Crucial modes of governance that characterized colonialism, particularly the relation between the militarized state and its subject populations, extend into the present moment. In a transfer of power, that of course is the well-known phrase, the government of a newly independent India renewed both colonial legislation and colonial attitudes in order to deal with challenges to its authority, particularly from populations at its peripheries who wish to choose their own form of national or even subnational political formation. Further, as India achieves global economic heft, the policing functions of the state, far from being whittled down, are being rapidly enhanced to deal not only with problems at the borders, but with any form of resistance mounted by mobilized citizens within, whether these be communities protesting large-scale industrialization that alienates them from their livelihood, or people who wish to call sharp attention to the age-old socio-economic structures that are responsible for their historical dispossession. Section 3. The nation-state as a political formation and as an actor on the world stage is a comparatively recent phenomenon, and it is worth remembering that the bulk of nation-states across the globe are products of empire. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, there were certainly interlinked forms of political and economic collectivity before European colonization, but the boundaries of nations as they exist today are more often than not the creation of imperial governance or of corresponding processes of decolonization. Given this provenance of the nation-state, it is extraordinary how much power it exerts, both materially and ideologically, to define, limit, and mobilize populations. However, it is perhaps even more extraordinary how much effort nation-states expend to police elements of their population who do not identify or are not allowed to identify with the nation, and who, for a variety of reasons, are not empowered as full citizens. Ironically, this is the case even within post-colonial democratic nations, where the electoral system that grants each adult a vote does not compensate for other historical forms of marginalization suffered by large sections, occasionally even majorities, and the Dalit instance is exactly this, occasionally even majorities of their citizens. To that extent, independent India's security establishment has been built not only to counter Pakistan, with which it has fought 3 wars, and China 1 war, or, and this is a recent possibility, to extend its power across oceans but also to coerce its own populations into maintaining the borders drawn precipitously and often unfairly by the departing British colonial administration. For instance, in October 1947, when the Indian Army and Air Force flew into Srinagar in order to repel tribal irregulars originating from Western Kashmir and Pakistan, and thus incorporated sections of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir into India, the Indian state extended its frontiers, but also put into place systems that denied large sections of the Kashmiri population the right to determine their own political identity, a problem which, as we know, continues to fester. In other border campaigns in the northeast, the Indian state continues to deploy the army and paramilitaries against tribal populations who wish for sovereign homelands in Nagaland, Mizoram, and Manipur. In the last 3 decades, state boundaries have been redrawn in that region to accommodate local demands, but any attempts to carve out independent or even autonomous homelands have been put down, often brutally, by the armed forces. In each case, political processes and civil governance have been routinely marginalized to allow military, quote-unquote, solutions. As his brief account suggests, India is no stranger to the use of the army and the paramilitaries against its own populations. If Great Britain and the United States, the two dominant imperial powers of the last 2 centuries, offer any precedents, there that empire building is a process that requires the suppression, the forced amalgamation of populations within as much as elsewhere. The political mentality and methods of the modern imperial state are a product of these twin processes. The state hones its capacity for military violence at home, even as it projects it across the borders. Further, these nation-states offer their marginalized subjects, particularly those who have resisted their territorial and political authority, a simple bargain. Accept the suzerainty of the state and the centralized control of economic development, including those made available by access to opportunities in captive markets abroad, or be constantly at the receiving end of state surveillance and military action. This is, in fact, one of the purposes of raising larger and more numerous paramilitary forces. This is a growth industry in India, where the local and regional identities of recruits are subordinated into a highly disciplined form of nation-centricism. Equally important, recruits from one state or region are used to police populations in others. Cultural, linguistic, and occasionally religious differences between paramilitaries and locals enable more militaristic and uncaring forms of intervention. The logic and history of the colonial state inform the structures of post-colonial governance to a point where they stunt any possibility of political thought and action that respects modes of collective being other than those defined by a coercive form of national belonging. However, the problem of Kashmir for independent India should not be understood simply as a failure of democratic governance or of punitive policing and military methods. I have mentioned some ideological, that is, nationalist reasons why different constituencies and political parties in India insist that Kashmir is an inalienable part of the nation. For the Bharatiya Janata Party and other proponents of hardline nationalism, no territory must be ceded to secessionists. Center-state relations, no matter how iniquitous, must not be rethought, and no limits should be imposed on the power of the army for fear of damaging their morale. Any amendment of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, for instance, will be seen, they think, as a tacit admission of its misuse by the army. The Congress, perhaps only because it leads the central government, is less publicly committed to such an unyielding response, but it too treats Kashmir as a problem in governance, rather than as an occasion for any sustained rethinking about the political forms of autonomy in that state, or indeed about federalism in India. Communist parliamentarians have called for a reassessment of India's security regime in Kashmir, but they too have not encouraged any full-blown debate about center-state relations. In each case, one of the assumptions that guides Indian political thinking about Jammu, Ladakh, and Kashmir is that this region represents a palimpsestic history where the confluence of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam have created a cultural texture that is particularly Indian. This is certainly a laudable religio-cultural ideal, but not when it is asserted to repress the socio-economic history of the state since at least the middle of the 19th century, which features the struggle of the impoverished majority for their economic, human, and political rights. If anything, I'm going to skip a little bit. We should also remember that there are very powerful material reasons for India to possess Kashmir, or indeed for Pakistan to hold on to its sections of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. I will not elaborate on these here, as many of these details are under-researched or hidden in official secrecy, but will call attention to some salient issues. There are hydrocarbon deposits, oil and gas, though of course there hasn't been much exploration or drilling in the last 2 decades because of violence in the state. Ladakh is likely to contain rare materials of a variety of sorts, though it is not yet clear whether these are extensive enough to reward mining. However, as India expands its investments in nuclear power and weaponry, the importance of exploitable uranium and thorium deposits cannot be underestimated. But perhaps most important is the question of water resources. Ever since partition, India and Pakistan have quarreled over the usage of the waters of the 5 rivers that flow into Punjab. The 1960 Indus Water Treaty, which seems to have worked so far achieved a tenuous accord. In recent years, Indian hydroelectrical projects and the development of catchment areas and water control mechanisms have polarized matters again. And Pakistani leaders, aware that the origins of rivers in the Indian region of Kashmir gives India great strategic leverage, have protested vociferously. As a local journalist, Harun Mirani, points out, India is clear about the geostrategic and foreign policy implications of its hydroelectrical projects in Kashmir. Mirani also points to a further wrinkle. India has refused to allow the Jammu and Kashmir state government to build and operate dams like the Krishan Ganga and Balighar projects, which have been commissioned and built by the National Hydropower Corporation, thus ensuring central control over the production and distribution of electricity to the detriment of both the state exchequer and its consumers of electricity. The same argument is being made by the Assamese government about natural gas and oil resources there. In all these ways, Kashmir represents a fundamental political challenge to the democratic functioning of the post-colonial nation-state, but certainly not a unique challenge, as the histories of Naga and Manipuri and elements of Assamese self-assertion and now tribal self-assertion in central India illustrate. I will not here touch upon solutions, not in this length of time. An army of politicians, administrators, and experts continue to work on what seems to be an intractable polarization between state and people, Indian nationalism, and Kashmiri self-determination. But I will remind us that we have a proud history of progressive ideas, those that fed the politics of decolonization to draw on, ideas that insisted that the evolution of our independent, egalitarian democracy was an ongoing process, open-ended in its possibilities, and constantly aware of the need to develop and respect modes of self-determination, including those at odds with conventional political wisdom. Such openness, and openness to a genuinely post-colonial future, will be of great consequence not only to India, but to the world community in which it plays an increasingly consequential role. If we are to continue to desire and bring into being more democratic and egalitarian forms of human development across the globe, we should realize that that effort too begins at home. I actually had a video I wanted to show, a protest video from Kashmir, but I have run out of time, so I'm going to hold off on that, and if we have time later, come back to it.
See the video later.
Well, that was an incredibly rich set of papers
Thank you.
in themselves, and also what's very striking, I thought, listening to them and also reflecting on what I'd read, was the tensions between them. But they seem to be sort of creative and productive tensions. So I wanted to ask 2 questions to try to, in a way, link them. The first was for Mukulika, which is very striking for all the reasons she said, that there is a great commitment to voting in India, particularly amongst less privileged sections. And you explained today why that might be happening. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why you think it happened in the first place at all. And let me explain that, which is, in the 19th century, conservatives and liberals, for different reasons in Europe, thought that democracy would eventually usher in rule by the poor majorities. That's what democracy, if you extended the franchise, would allow. It's one person, one vote. And in the 20th century, socialists thought the same thing. It's one of the reasons so many socialist parties actually decided to contest parliamentary elections in Western Europe. And Nehru and Ambedkar, at their juncture thought the same thing. But yet we know from comparative historical analysis that actually, of course, in most established democracies of the world, the relatively disenfranchised vote less than their more privileged counterparts. So it sort of still seems to raise the question, why did it happen in the first place over a long term? If you can think of a sort of a long-term development, or the rituals and so on seem to sort of give it reasons to work now. But what led to that in the first place? You mentioned towards the end certain practices of cooperation in Indian society in various venues that may facilitate that. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And I wanted to connect this question to Suvir Kaul's analysis, which was, it was very difficult to do, at once passionate and analytical and incisive. And your argument seems to be that we know that for most of Kashmir's history, they've not had free and fair elections. But recently, a lot of commentators say they have had, starting in 2002, the election of the People's Democratic Party, and more recently. And in fact, in the last election, what was striking is despite many calls for boycotting the polls, the numbers went up. So that would seem to suggest that if you actually allow elections to happen, and you let them happen consistently, you might have a similar effect in Kashmir over time. I mean, it's a more speculative question, as you've had in other parts of India. Yet at the same time, what's distinct about Kashmir, of course, is the occupation, the presence of mass troops, and legislation like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which has all kinds of draconian elements, right? Granting impunity to soldiers on various counts. So there your story seems to be that this is a question, to use the themes of the panel, where the claim to sovereignty, of course, is undermining the possibility of justice. And yet in the Indian Constitution, the law itself provides resources for both positions. On the one hand, the Indian Constitution has an article 370, which actually gives special asymmetric rights to Kashmir, but it's been violated. That's the problem. On the other hand, the Constitution also grants the center all kinds of powers to legislate things like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the Disturbed Areas Act, what some scholars have called routine emergencies, which suspend the rule of law. So I was wondering if you can say a little bit more, because the sovereignty question, of course, is very striking. If we think of Tamil Nadu in the 50s, if we think of Punjab in the 80s, in both cases, many people thought the union the integrity of the union was threatened. And because there was a devolution of power, amongst many other things, certainly Punjab in the 80s, which was almost a civil war, was a civil war. By the late 1990s, whatever other legacies that were negative happened, that situation finished. So here, the question of Kashmir seems to be that it's exactly the concept of sovereignty that is contested by Pakistan as well. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more how you think about the sort of interaction of these things. And then I'll just finish by asking Professor Guru is an extremely interesting essay, and he makes a very intriguing distinction, which you briefly noted. And I've been reading this literature for a long time, and I hadn't seen anybody make the distinction quite the way you had, between self-esteem and self-respect. That was it was very intriguing. And so the argument, of course, is that if you grant reservations in India, which are really a radical form of affirmative action, it's a quota. It's a numerical quota. It's not a consideration that you take into account. You simply provide a numerical quota. Dalits comprise 15% population. They get 15% of the seats. And you made the argument that that can give you self-esteem, amongst other things, but not self-respect, because self-respect has to be dialogical. It requires the respect you're granted from others. And in that sense, your argument reminded me of things I used to read a long time ago about, for instance, certain African-American scholars making a similar argument in the context of America, that affirmative action attaches a certain stigma to it. Now, I take it that you would not be against various compensatory mechanisms for Dalits. And yet you have this position, and you also have a critique of liberal democracy. And what's interesting there is other scholars, I think of somebody like Pratap Mehta, also has a critique of democracy in India, but his argument is actually not yours. His is saying it's not liberal enough. Because we have these quotas and reservations, that undermines the liberalism in India's representative democracy. So it's very intriguing that you seem to take a position which is like his, yet you're from a very different stance, and you seem to want to go in a very different place. So I was wondering if you might say a little bit more about that.
I think one needs to systematically see what accounts of the early elections, to see your question, I'm presuming. You're presumably saying from 1951 onwards, why was there enthusiasm?
Well, I think most of it, people say it was an uptake sort of after the late 70s onwards, but whenever you...
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the one should have sort of slightly more precise data on whether there is, in fact, a greater uptake as we go along, because that will be interesting. What is evident, I think the historical, what seems to be, even the little bit of writing that there is on early elections and so on, is this great sense of excitement. And, I think the only published piece I can think of is Ram Guha's piece on the first election. And there you get this extraordinary, the stories could have been happening today, right, of people climbing mountains literally to get to the polling station and carrying aging relatives to it and so on. And you get that in last week's election as well. One historical argument that certainly can be made is this comes out of a mass politics. And in the 50s, certainly, there's a sense of nationhood, which elections help to bond, right? So, there is a larger argument about nationalism. Now one would say with the army or Bollywood or cricket, there are, Arjun's written about this, there are few genuinely pan-national institutions, and certainly elections would fall in that. But certainly at the beginning, unlike the other three, elections were able to introduce this straight away. What is also, I think, the techne of democracy, the material culture of democracy and the responsiveness of the Election Commission to taking into account social reality of India in formulating the technology of elections is something that we don't recognize often enough. So that, that story of Sukumar Sen, the first election commissioner, of scrapping the first round of voter lists, all of them saying, because when people went out, enumerators went out and made up voters lists, came back with information, all the women would not name their, they were all listed as wife of and daughter of various men. And he said, what rubbish is this? We can't have women have their own names, we should have their names on the electoral list. And it was expensive, it delayed things, Nehru was on his back, he wanted to hold the elections, and yet he insisted. He said, no, we're going to have proper voters lists. Now this kind of, in 61, the second election commissioner introduces the indelible ink, and I'm just about to interview his daughter, he's passed away, but his daughter on some of the history of why the black mark was introduced. Recently now, of course, there is the third gender, the eunuchs are now have a category. There is a responsiveness in the way in which elections are held, which certainly from my ethnographic sense, I find people feel a great sense of noblesse oblige. Here is an institution that is being responsive to us. The least we can do in return is participate. So I'm giving you a very ground sense of what clearly, of course, if one looks at the sort of three phases of democracy argument that Yogendra writes about and so on, there are other larger processes which make people participate. But I think it has to be a much more fundamental understanding about participation, which is not about vote banks or not about trying to win electoral power, but about participation. And yes, I mean, I do try and make a large argument, which I can't make in full here, but it is to say that the notion of citizenship that democratic participation requires people to have a sense of belonging to a whole that is much larger than the sum of the parts, and to be aware that, this is sort of Rousseau sense of citizenship, that you should be able to imagine the common good. Now, that doesn't come out of nowhere. And I would push it on the basis of my sort of agrarian-based data, in this very rural setting, that wherever there are community activities, people understand the need for cooperation to create something. So it's coming out of somewhere. And therefore, the fact that urban voter turnout rates are always low and have consistently been low might have something to do with that. That's one response.
I can't do this for you in the kind of detail that, that is necessary to make this argument, but I want to derive from Mukulika's arguments a single idea, which is that voting as a central feature of parliamentary democracy is a learned behavior. And the learning process has to come from recognizing that there are choices to be made, that you can, whether it's only once in 4 years, actually participate in making those choices. Now, if you look at the history of elections in Kashmir, the first few are astonishing. I only learned this very recently when I started reading up. Nobody that I know of, even Kashmiris, actually acknowledged this. The first few elections after independence, the returning officer decided who was going to stand for election. And that was it, one candidate per constituency. And this is not simply, not for a second do I want to suggest that this is a central conspiracy. Kashmiri leaders, whether it was Sheikh Abdullah or Bakshi Ghulam Ahmad after him, were very happy to collaborate in this farcical understanding of how to hold elections. But it meant that there was an enormous degree of cynicism and disempowerment connected with elections. The first technically fair elections were the ones that were held after Mrs. Gandhi died. But the very next elections, 1987, massively rigged. There was a possibility that several pro-Pakistani electoral parties who had allied under the rubric of the Muslim United League or Muslim United Party, I can't remember which, the election was completely taken away from them, to a point where my aunt and uncle, he is a senior government official. She is a senior professor at a women's college. When they went to vote, they were literally told, why did you bother to come? It's been taken care of. This is one. What we don't remember in all of this is that the head of the Hizbul Mujahideen, this is of course anecdotal and biographical, what is the matter with me? Syed, can anyone give me his name? The head of the, No, the Hizbul Mujahideen in Pakistan. Anyway, man with a vast beard and gun. Syed Salahuddin.
Yes.
Contested those elections. Yasin Malik, one of the founders of JKRF, was his returning officer. Salahuddin was arrested in the polling booth for coming there to complain about this. He spent some weeks in jail. The next thing he did was clear out to Pakistan. Now, since then, and this is part of the paradox of electoral democracy, there have been at least 2 elections, including the very recent panchayat elections, high turnouts, which a lot of people, but there is a simple, and I don't know if you can take this at its face value, but if you ask Kashmiris who are solidly independentist, many people I know, why did you vote? They say, these are elections designed to make sure that our municipal arrangements are available to us. These are not our opinions about our relationship with India. Now, is that a paradox? Absolutely. But it isn't. There are also more complicated reasons. The much feared Ikhwanis, that is the people who are turned militants, who have turned into stooges of the Indian police, the Jammu and Kashmir police, who do the bulk of the killings. It's not the police or the CRPF, or indeed even the army. There have been spectacular instances where they have been brutal. But it's not them that do the killings. It's these turned Ikhwanis. They subtly resurfaced before the last state election. And they were seen driving around it. Now, this is all very anecdotal, and it doesn't add up to a coherent account of why people chose to vote. But these are all elements in that puzzle. But has this dented the pro-independence sentiment that I know of from my visits there? I haven't seen it happening. And last year, and this is partly what I wanted to show you that video based on, there was a massive shift in the forms of protest. It was young people on the streets with stones, drawing inspiration from the Palestinian Intifada. And the number of deaths was actually quite extraordinary. Any other place in the world, there would have been systematic international outcry. There was pretty much nothing internationally. The K word, as we know, neither Cameron nor Obama dared utter it when they came on their recent visits to India.
I mean, what's interesting there is that because the elections were never allowed to run properly, no Communitas develops, but for rational reasons, people are voting now for basic. That's what you're suggesting.
Sanjay, you are asking me this question: what is the nature of Dalit critique? Is it particular or it is universal? So you are linking it up with the African American experience in this part of the world. I think my presentation might give you the idea that this is a very specific, particular critique of Indian democracy, which is not the case actually. It's the most universal critique of Indian democracy. Why it is universal? Because it is asking questions which are of universal importance, questions of dignity, questions of recognition. I should imagine a democracy in which I should be able to appear in the public sphere without the sense of shame. Even for now, it is a changed thing. Now, do I really appear in the public with that confidence that I am not really being, I'm not the recipient of this castious gaze of the people? So, to that extent, I think African American also are facing the same question. And I have mentioned this point in the American context. African American people just don't grow in the eyes of the whites, and that is what Toni Morrison says. Similarly, people in the Dalits in India do not grow in the eyes of the upper caste. So that is the situation. To that extent, the critique of the Dalit critique is also the same time universal critique. So this is one, and therefore the African American and the Dalits really share one vision of egalitarianism, and that to say that they are fighting for the democracy in which they will have one person, one value, not differential value. But instead what we have is one person, one vote. That's a very, very limited understanding of democracy. That's one aspect of Dalit critique being universal. The other question is a little tricky in the sense, a very important question at the same time. What is the difference between actually how do we sequentialize democracy or liberalism? And here I am defining liberalism in terms of modernity. That you have to really first of all put your institution. This is what Pratap would argue. You have to put your institutional practice on a very sound footing. You must have the knowledge to follow procedures, know the rules, know and all that you should know. You should become modern first, and then only you should demand for democracy. But if I am an egalitarian, if I am the follower of the subaltern thought, quote unquote subaltern, I would not privilege modernity over democracy. I will always privilege democracy over modernity. And there will be opposition to this. 1917, Lokmanya Tilak, who is the father of Indian unrest, he was so much unhappy with the Teli, Tamboli, the OBCs coming to the parliament. He said, why the hell you are trying for this? You have to wait. You are not sufficiently modern. But Phule Ambedkar said, no, doesn't matter. We want democracy first. We are illiterate, fine, but we can always learn later. So democracy first and modernity later. So you want, liberalism wants modernity to mature and take roots among the people. It is a huge point. Until then you enjoy the fruits of modernity. Keep these guys. That's a debate in India, actually. So I think that would not. If the people who got the benefits of democracy and got into the opportunity structure, that is their moral duty to see that they don't rubbish the institutions. But don't keep them out on the basis that you are not sufficiently liberal, you are not sufficiently modern. That's it. Thank you.
Mukulika, did you want to?
Just to come back on this point of self-esteem and self-respect, certainly in my field site, what I've found is they would be classified as Dalits. The word is never used in West Bengal. But I certainly found, in fact, evidence of both. And that is not simply because, this is where just electoral politics or democratic one person, one vote is not enough. The reason why you get both is because there have been extensive land reforms in this area. And things have changed in a generation. And there is, you can very clearly see that there has been both. So in isolation, it's not enough. But in a funny way, the confidence or the impulse to participate is born out of the self-esteem that comes out of just reconfiguring power relations completely by who is allowed to own land. It can, ultimately, this is what it comes down to.
If anyone has any questions or comments, there are 2 microphones on either side. Please come. And if you could just introduce yourself.
My name is Raman. I'm of Indian origin. All the topics of terrific importance for all Indians anywhere. My question is a hypothetical. What would happen if Dalits represent 100% of India? Will there be a reservation in that India where everyone in India is a Dalit? Will there be a reservation? Will there be a quota for someone who is not qualified academically? Does it make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, okay. Very much.
Okay. Do you want to answer?
Well, I mean, is it desirable to convert everybody into a Dalithood?
No, it's hypothetical. My question is hypothetical.
I won't say that it's a desirable thing. That's why we are all now. There are different things happening in India, and I'm very happy to note. Not very happy, but that you have the Kashmiri question is almost the Kashmiri question. The question of the Kashmiri Pandit is almost. If not almost, but similar to the Dalit question in some way. You are otherized by the state. You are otherized by the civil society. You are feeling the brunt of it. What it means to be ghettoized in colonies in Jammu and Kashmir. So that, in a way, is really bridging the gap at the emotional level. But that is not the desirable state of affairs that we want. Not at all. But now that we are talking about the questions in post facto, that now the situation is given to us, we have to handle it. And you have a liberal response to handle it, and liberal response is always gradual. It's not Dalit who want to remain Dalit. It is the state which creates Dalitness among the Dalits. And that is the construction of the state.
Can I just ask you to elaborate on one issue that you brought up in your essay, you didn't mention here? It's also very intriguing. You say there's a need for an ethical revolution in Indian democracy. And it seems to speak to this issue about identities, self-esteem, self-respect.
Is it my?
It was your. The argument was that legal reform and political institutions.
Can I just take a minute on this? I skipped that point. I skipped 2 points, and actually, but they are there in the published paper, luckily. So one is that I've always said that we require. I made those 2 points. One is that it's not enough to have equality before law. We should also have equality before moral law. That's to treat people as equal, not in terms of your positional strength, but in terms of your moral status. That you are also a decent human being. You are a sentient being. So that is the moral law. But this should become, this moral consciousness should become it should actually permeate the whole civil society, which is not the case. We find today that people want to really, they privilege they prize their social dominance so much, or even they want to go to the court and settle the issues in the court. They do not want really to settle the issues outside the court. They can pay any price, but they want to really exhaust this Dalit who want to take them to the court. And going to the court is beneficial to the socially dominant sections, because they can therefore preserve their own social dominance, which is outside the court. That's to say, am I making sense? In the sense that, you ask anybody who's perpetuating atrocities against women and Dalit, they would say, we will not consider them as equal to us. We will always say that they are different, we are different. That moral differentiation will always remain in the realm of civil society. You will never get the recognition from a person in civil society. Suppose you ask somebody in the different laws, 89 Anti-Atrocity Act, that you need to really treat me properly as a human being. He said, I won't treat you properly as a human being. You can take me to the court of law. So, in a way, tragically, courts have become an instrument in really preserving social dominance. And once they reach the court, they always know that, the court is in their favor. And look at this Bhauri Devi judgment, one of the horrendous judgment on democracy. The judge says that how can an upper caste judge rape a lower caste woman? It is not in the culture of this upper caste judge to really touch the lower caste woman. And this person who is committing kinds of atrocity in the realm of civil society knows this very well. So he would always prefer to settle, he only will always prefer to settle the issues in the realm of legality, not in civility. And therefore...
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Kaul. You have raised many provocative points, but only one I will touch upon. That is Azadi, independence for Kashmir. When India and Pakistan got independence, there were 356 princely states. They had only one option, either join India or Pakistan. Independence was not an option. So later on, we cannot even go there now, considering, because there are other regions will demand the same thing.
I want to know on what basis you say independence was not an option.
At that time, no. They were given only one, either to join India.
Who gave them that right is the question.
Transfer of power arrangement.
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, the
That's
transfer
exactly my
with
point.
the British. The
That's what I'm
transfer of power arrangement with the leaders of independence movement.
Absolutely. It was something that the British Empire mandated and our leaders took on very happily.
At least acquiesced in. Our leaders agreed to that.
Yes.
They did not dictate. British, it's not a mandate. Our leaders accepted that arrangement, okay?
In the same way as they accepted what?
A factual mistake here.
Yeah.
Sorry. The mistake
Maybe
is...
356 or...
No. Sorry, I just want to correct the fact.
Please.
The fact is that in the case of Kashmir, Nehru agreed that there would be a plebiscite.
Let me come to that point. Oh, you're jumping ahead, please.
Okay.
The Raja of Kashmir, 2 minutes. It will take only 2 minutes. I'm not going. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
I'm not.
I'm coming to Nehru's point. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Then, just now, transfer of power arrangement, the Raja vacillated. So, the Nehru, both parties agreed, let them give them time, the standstill agreement. That was what she is referring to. Nehru from this side and Jinnah and others from that side agreed to the standstill agreement.
That's wrong. That's just wrong in fact. That is just wrong in fact.
This is historical fact, sir.
I'm afraid you're wrong. Anya, I'll take care of this. That was just wrong. Jinnah at no point agreed to what happened. It took 15 months of warfare to get to the standstill.
In violation of this agreement,
no,
Pakistan sent...
That isn't accurate.
Okay, I think, I'm sorry, I let this go on between. I think we need to...
Yes, exactly.
I'll conclude my question.
I
So,
think there's a
if we
disagreement.
cannot go there now,
Was arrested because he was going to be, charges was that he wanted to be independent.
Yeah.
I think that's all.
anyway, the independence
Okay,
will
so-
forget
so
that.
we
Now,
haven't-
if we allow
I'm
to
sorry,
join
sir.
either India or Pakistan, what about the Lashkari, Taiba people who are roaming around Kashmir? So there will not be...
You've been to Kashmir recently and have seen the Lashkar-e-Toiba roaming around there?
Are guerrillas going to announce to you that they are guerrillas?
The
I
Indian
think-
Army has announced over and over again in the last 4 years that the number of militants operating in Kashmir is well below 500. They have destroyed the insurrection.
One bomber, suicide bomber will do
Sir,
to
I
destroy.
think you made your point.
Anyway,
I think if you
yeah,
just...
go
if you,
ahead. There's no solution. The line of control, make it permanent international border.
That solves nothing. But anyway.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? And I understand some of these issues are very sensitive issues. But if you can pose your question and comment, and then allow one of the speakers, to whoever it's directed to respond.
First of all, thank you all for your comments today. This question is for Dr. Banerjee. I've heard you give this talk before, and one of the most compelling parts of the argument is, and one of the richest discussions, is the one that you make about the cultural archive that the voters are referring to. So, and especially largely illiterate communities of voters, they're invoking this cultural archive, right? So can you firstly talk more about this? I know you didn't have time to kind of get into all of that. And related to this, if we are going to rely on this cultural archive and all its links to community identity and individual identity, how does this all get suspended in that liminal moment when you're in the voting booth, right, and you're just a voter? Like, how does that get suspended? And if it does, the better question is, does it at all? And if not, then can we really leave out this discussion of who are they voting for? Like, can you leave out this discussion of the cultural logic that leads this voter to X or Y candidate? So, like, in other words, and I wrote this all down because I'm very nervous. In other words, is it the whole thing about your argument that's very interesting is that we're approaching democracy via ethnography. And so can we then also use this to use this cultural archive to sort of understand voting patterns, like why people are voting for certain parties or certain candidates? Or
It's a good question.
No, it's a great question, which I can't, I mean, this is going to be the bulk of the book argument. But let me give you one example, which I think you've heard before, but in that paper you're referring to, which was a more exhaustive one. One thing, for the benefit of the audience, the cultural archive, it's a Foucauldian idea, but it's really to see or social imaginaries, if you want to use Taylor's term, what exists in social life, such that we don't talk about an imposition of a liberal idea that's come out of nowhere and suddenly it's imposed on the masses and people embrace it, and why do they embrace it, and so on. And the idea is, it's exactly the opposite of the vernacularization of democracy argument. It's not to say that these foreign ideas are then rooted in local practices. It is seeing why these ideas are adopted, because there's resonances in local social practices and cultural understandings of participation that people make sense of it. So the best example, I think, to do quickly is a harvest, right? Is where you have, now there's been land reforms, the elites have lost land to the sharecroppers. It's a very tense moment. Everybody's had to work incredibly hard to bring in the harvest. You're not going to get a good price for your yield, but you still have to do the work. And during a harvest, I would argue, for instance, is a similar liminal moment in that community when it's interesting, the sheer materiality of it, the fact that everybody is covered in the dust of threshing machines and the labor, the sheer hard physical labor that is required to bring in a harvest. I know who is who, and you can tell what, people from and what caste, and who is a Sayyid, who is a Sheikh, etc. But at the moment of the harvest, like the black mark, everybody is covered in husk dust, right? And all that is obfuscated. Now, what that also signifies is that moment, people, of course, you don't forget you're a Sayyid or you don't forget you're a Dalit for 1 second, but you also understand that at that moment, your identity that comes to the fore, and the only one that is significant to make that harvest work is of somebody who has a particular task of either cutting or threshing or tying or sweeping or whatever you're doing. And unless you continue to do that, regardless of who you are, the harvest is not going to happen. Now, it's that kind of understanding of cooperation that then translates, I would say, in the democratic case, where people are saying, they might not say it. That's why this is the other interesting thing. It has to be ethnographic, because people don't, when you ask them why you vote, they're not going to say, oh yes, I bring in the harvest, so I understand cooperative activity and voting is like that. That's why you need anthropologists. But what ethnography does is it allows you to see these connections. So when they're saying that, look, at that one moment, I might be Dalit, but on this day, nobody can say, oh, I'm not going to stand next to you, because they know that at a polling station, you stand next to whoever you happen to have arrived next to, and you queue together. And the models from Islam is a very good model for egalitarianism that people work with, saying, look at the way they say their prayers. They don't count, there's no temple entry problems in a mosque, or how you say your Eid prayers. So it is these kinds of things that give the ideas that already exist. So democracy is not just a foreign set of ideas, people understand them, isn't it? Whether this translates to who they vote for is a much longer, and I think that's why, showing you those images of the Trinamool challenge to the left front, it's a lot more. Again, look at the English news channels or the newspapers, it's all about personalities. So it's about Mamata Banerjee as if she exists, and even Mamata Banerjee is not, very few journalists actually go and ask people why they are voting for Mamata Banerjee, why they like her, for instance. But whether this sense of cooperation translates into who they're going to vote for is a much more complex argument, which I won't go into here. Thank you.
Yes, if you can please come. If you can just speak into the mic, we're recording the session, so.
Okay, also a question for...
And if you could just introduce yourself, please.
I'm Katyayani, I'm an anthropology student at the New School. It's also a question for Professor Banerjee. It's about, liminality. So, as far as I understand, liminal spaces are also spaces of transition. So, I'm interested in, if you're using this theorization, then, so is there a transition after the moment of liminality? Does the voter leave as something different, or, does the person leave as a citizen, or do they go back to what they previously, their previous identity? And if so, then what is the, I guess a little more on how you theorize liminality here.
Okay, that helps me refine what I'm trying to say. I didn't say this in my talk, but the liminal phase, in a sense, is inaugurated the day the elections are announced. And what is called the Model Code of Conduct comes into play by the Election Commission, right? So everybody's terrified of the Model Code of Conduct because you've got to behave yourselves. Suddenly, politicians, administration, everybody is aware that now the rules are different. And there's a different kind of electoral time that is inaugurated through that. And it requires different modes of civility, different modes of behavior, different modes of efficiency, discipline, etc. Election day is the culmination of this liminality, right? Where everything has been suspended. The rules are different. There is electricity. There's no load shedding, for instance, during a campaign, because the incumbents always want to put a good faith. So everything is extraordinary. People are enjoying, that's why they love it, because things work. But at the moment of voting, it is the transition, at one level is, yes, you go back to deep social inequality, having glimpsed equality, and which is exactly what, if you read Turner, since you're an anthropologist, what he says about the relationship between the male initiates during a communita, what creates the communitas, is that shared sense that shared sense of belonging to a group of people who have done something, who've been initiated together, lasts. There is an enduring quality to that as well. So you can go back to deep social equality, but it is informed by an experience of political equality. And that's why it's sacred, it's so precious, because that's the only moment where you are able to experience it. In another way, it's transition simply because, West Bengal was ruled by the Left Front since 1977, and in 2 days' time, when the liminal phase ends, the day the results are declared, it ends really, and you go back to normality when the new government comes in. It's a different phase of a new government. There's also that, there's just...
I just wanted to ask a question following up, which is this example of the... Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't see anybody standing up.
I think we have talked about the elections in India. And the things looks like people are very much anxious to vote for. We have not given what the picture is. How we get a large number of criminals in the parliament if it is simply the election. We have not put the money. And how long we are independent. Why still we have a reservation? That means we have not been able to uplift the people who are discriminated in the past. So we have given just as if wonderful things are happening in India. This gap between the rich and poor is increasing there. American, they say everything is wonderful. They have increases there. Same thing is happening there. And Manmohan Singh, when he said 35 million people are poverty level and food was deteriorating, and he said, I can't do anything. He could not even take care of the food and distribute free, although the Supreme Court said they should do it, but he could not. So a lot of time we give the picture India is growing. We don't know there is a certain group, and there is a lot of corruption in the election. And if you are not rich and you are not with the criminals, you can't get elected. And see in Punjab now, what is happening there. So I think we are giving very nice picture, but...
I just want.
So can I just say two things?
Just one second. I just realized we have 3 minutes, and you asked me to remind you to finish. So I just wanted to give everyone a chance to.
And you didn't want to get your question?
No, that's fine. But if each of you want to take a turn, when you're responding to this question or having any concluding thoughts. But Mukli, why don't you go first, and then.
I just want to say, I mean, this is nothing that you say is untrue, and it only reinforces the puzzle I pose. If this is indeed the state of affairs, why on earth do people bother engaging with the system? They could, and that's why a lot of people who stay away sound like you. So if anything, this is why analytically you need to explain. It is not to say everything is fine with India. In fact, the question is, so much is wrong, and yet people participate. What the hell is going on?
Can I say? I won't raise larger questions, but I would like to really come back to the discussion on what kind of democracy you want. You want episodical democracy for 2 days, 3 days, or democracy forever? That's one question. So to put it differently, do you really want democracy as a life condition or life situation? In situation, there's a temporality involved, but the condition is a permanency. You enjoy on a regular basis. And I think that's the ethical revolution one is asking for. Yeah.
Should I respond or should I show the video?
I think you show the video.
So,
it is, do you not have time? It's 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Do we have time?
I have a couple of
Public choice.
This is here's what I would suggest. I know that some people have to leave at 6:30, including one of our panelists. But at the same time, for those who would like to stay to see the video of its 5 minutes, then I think that
I warn you, it has some violent images. So those who have squeamish
to go. So I just wanted to thank Professor Banerjee, who has to leave and catch a plane, for a presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. We can go and then see it.
Okay, our top story, and it comes from Jammu and Kashmir, where the role of security forces handling the unrest is already under the scanner. The CRPF IG in the valley has already been recalled after charges that his troops were targeting civilians.
5 people have been injured today as locals are protesting the killing of a 12-year-old boy.
Now, Kashmiri's struggle for their right to self-determination has seen many decades, but for how long Indian forces' atrocities will continue remains an enigma.
Supergram music.
This song right here is dedicated to my people in Kashmir. Yeah. They say where you run from darkness, all you seek is light. But when the blood spills over, you will stand and fight. Threats of deceit born around the world of plebiscite by treacherous puppet politicians who have no soul inside. My paradise is burning with troops left loose with ammo, who murder and rape the night behind a political shadow. Like a casino, human life is thrown like a dice. I will summarize atrocities to the resurrection of Christ. Can you hear the screams? Now see the revolution. Their bullets are stones, don't talk restitution, cause the only solution is the resolution of freedom. Even Khusro will go back and doubt his untimely wisdom. These killings ain't random, it's an organized genocide. Sponsored media who hide this homicide. No more injustice, we won't go down when we bleed. Alive in the struggle, even the graves will speak. Yeah, I protest against the things you've done. I protest for a mother who lost her son. I protest, I will throw stones and never run. I protest until my freedom has come. I protest for my brother who's dead. I protest against the bullet in his head. I protest, I will throw stones and never run. I protest until my freedom is come. Democratically held elections, now that's completely absurd. I will tell you some stuff that you obviously never heard. A 10-year-old kid voted with all his fingers. A whole village gang raped, a crime still lingers. These are the tales from the dark side of a murderous regime. An endless occupation of our land and our dreams. Democratic politics has got our throats before we speak. How they talk about peace when there's blood in our streets. When freedom of speech is subjected to strangulation, flames of revolution engulf the population. They rise through suppression nation and march to be free. Face covered in a rag, labeled a revolutionary. To this fight for survival, I want the world to see a murderous oppression written down in police brutality. Stones in my hand, it's time you pay the price for plundering and rape in a beautiful paradise. I protest against the things you've done. I protest for a mother who lost her son. I protest, I will throw stones and never run. I protest until my freedom has come. I protest for my brother who's dead. I protest against the bullet in his head. I protest, I will throw stones and never run. I protest until my freedom has come. Let's remember all those who were martyred this year. Inayat Khan, Ramit Farooq, Zahid Farooq, Zubair Ahmed Bhatt, Tufail Ahmed Mattu, Rafiq Ahmed Bangru, Javed Ahmed Mallah, Shakil Ganai, Firdosh Khan, Bilal Ahmed Wani, Tajamul Bashir, Tawqir Rathar, Ishtiaq Ahmed, Imtiaz Ahmed Ittu, Sujatul Islam, Muzaffar Ahmed, Fayaz Ahmed Wani, Yasmin Jan, Abrar Ahmed Khan, Faizan Rafiq, Fayaz Ahmed Khande, Farooq Ahmed, Tariq Ahmed Dar, Mohammad Ahsan, Shaukat Ahmed, Mohammad Rafiq, Nasir Ahmed, Javed Ahmed Pili, Mudassir Lone, Naeem Shah, Rais Wani, Froza Pili, Isharat Rishi, Irshad Bhatt, Ashik Hussain, Ramiz Ahmed, Hafiz Yaqub, Tariq Dar, Khurshid Ahmed, Bashir Ahmed Rishi, Arshid Ahmed, Samir Rah, Mehrajuddin Lone, Amiz Ganai, Suhail Ahmed Dar, Jahangir Bhatt, Riyaz Ahmed, Mohammad Yaqub Bhatt, Iqbal Khan, Mohammad Akbar, Shabir Malik, Ghulam Nabi Baryari, Ramiz Rishi, Fida Nabi Lone, Farooq Bukhari, Mudassir Sarkar, Ali Mohammad Khande, Asif Mir, Samir Lone, Umar Ahmed Dar, Irshad Ahmed, Mohammad Abbas, Milad Ahmed Dar, Nazir Wani, Mudassir Nazir, Bilal Ahmed Sheikh, Umar Qayyum, Irshad Ahmed. And you will fight till the death of it. And you will fight till the death of it. And you will fight till the death of it.
Okay, I wish we had shown this earlier so we could actually have had a discussion or part of it. But we're quite a bit over time, so I think we're going to have to end. It's hard to know how to respond other than to say I think this session really shows the wide gamut about the questions of sovereignty, law, and justice in India and its democracy. If you think about the first images that Mukulika presented about elections and this video, and we didn't realize that it was there. We should have shown it before so we actually have a discussion about it. But I'd like, if you could join me in thanking the panel, and I'd like to also thank Aryan Mack and Arjun Upadhyay, who had to leave, unfortunately, for the conference as a whole. If anybody would like to continue the discussion with Suvir Kaul, I think he's here now. But okay, I'm not sure. I think, but we're over time now, so I think we're going to have to end it.